Hi, I'm Reed Peterson, and welcome to Grief Refuge. It warms my heart to know that you're here listening today, for you see, Grief Refuge is a very special podcast. The fact that you're listening right now is a validation that you care about yourself, your grief, and your healing. It also says that you understand personal care is important and you're interested in learning healthy ways to manage your grief. And that's why Grief Refuge is special. This podcast is here to help validate your grief journey, the difficulty involved, and provides hope and inspiration to manage this process and to help find peace and purpose. Through the stories and conversations shared on this podcast, the intention is to be a source of comfort and hope, and also a soothing voice to help you through feelings of despair, emptiness, loneliness, uncertainty, and many more. Grief is so hard, and I'm glad that you're here. I promise to do everything I can to provide more support to you. Before we begin, let's go over a little housekeeping. Because of the depth and the nature of this topic, it may be more beneficial to not multitask while listening. Rather, I invite you to use this time for your self-care and personal reflection. Use this time to relax and allow your grief-related feelings to run their course. Use this time to mourn your loss. On another note, this podcast publishes episodes twice a month. When you're grieving, that's a lot of time in between each episode, and it can leave a gap in your needs. If you find yourself seeking more support, then download the Grief Refuge app. The Grief Refuge app is a daily companion to help soothe and comfort you throughout this difficult journey. You can get the Grief Refuge app from the App Store on your smartphone. Thank you, and let's move on to today's topic. Today I'm sharing a conversation with a kindred spirit from the other side of the Pacific Ocean. Gabriela Georges, from the Grief Cocoon, shares her wisdom and experience in helping people use creative expression to process grief. Creative expression is critically important in life. There are times when a talk or a good cry just isn't enough. You need to use the right brain to engage in activities to open up some of the channels to help let things flow through you. This is all part of creative expression, and Gabriela does a wonderful job in sharing more. Enjoy. If it's okay with you, I would like to start talking about actually what attracts in your area, what attracts people to such a workshop where they can learn to express their grief. There's so many different ways you can use creative expression for your grief process. So I'm thinking about your situation where it's like, oh, I'd like to make this announcement to my community that there's these grief workshops, and I'm here to help people tap into their creativity to help process their grief. But like, I think that people need a bit of like prompting or gentle nudges or at least clear communication before they can say yes to something. So how do you get people attracted to the line of work that you do?
That's a good question. So I know from certain people that I guess, that they trust the work because they know me and they know the work that I've done and the, they might have seen me perform or they might have read some of my work and they know that I myself have used creativity to process grief. So that's one thing that might attract people who know me to the workshops. But there has been a lot of people who I don't know, and I think people realize, there's not a lot of spaces to just have open conversations about grief and to explore grief in their everyday life. And so, and they might already sort of be curious about what it might feel like to try and express or to try and process their grief creatively. So I think that it sort of attracts people that are curious. They're curious about how else they can process their grief and they want to try something different. And maybe, I guess I always, say to people, look, I'm not a therapist and this is not, I don't position the workshops as therapeutic, even though they might be, people might find them therapeutic, but it's more about just the creative process and how they might, pick up tools to actually process their grief in a different way. And they might not have done writing before, or they might have written before, but it doesn't matter. It's sort of accessible to people at all different levels. And, there was an animation workshop that I did. It was animation and writing. And I think people really were drawn to it because they'd never really heard of an animation and writing workshop to process grief, that's about grief and loss. And I think people found it interesting because they'd never done it before. And so it's I think it's for people who really are ready to kind of take a bit of a leap and to try something different. And it's also about creating a space where they can, just a space and time where they can sit with their grief, where they can explore it and do it with other people. I think that's a big part of it as well. But yeah, I do feel that it's maybe not for people who are looking for a traditional sort of way to think about their grief. And people might, there can be people who are more sort of interested in a one-on-one counseling or therapy, and that works for a lot of people. And people who've come to my workshops also can go to therapy and counseling, but this is kind of an alternative way. It's an alternative path for people who are interested in exploring a different way to explore grief. So yeah, I kind of probably would like to sort of talk with more people about, people that I don't know just have come because a friend has sent them a link, to the event page, or they just heard about it somewhere and they don't know me at all, so it does take a lot of trust, I think. And people might come in a little bit hesitant or a little bit reluctant. They won't feel comfortable straight away, but it's over time. I think it's in the way that you facilitate a session and the way that you begin that kind of you have to sort of earn people's trust in the process before going into a creative activity where you're asking them to explore their grief or to share their experiences. But I've been really surprised by how open people are, because I think they know that the purpose of the workshop or of the event is to have open conversations or is to process grief and loss. So they come in with knowing that that's what the space is for. So I think that helps as well, that it's not just a general workshop. It's a creative workshop, but it's about grief and loss.
It's super interesting. I know that the communities that we're a part of are very far apart in the world. So there's a natural curiosity for me as an American, trying to learn more about what draws people to workshops for grief support. And yeah, I'm sorry to generalize it in such a large area, but in Australia. And so is it fair to assume that you find, earlier you mentioned people seeking something unique to experience in their grief? So I guess assumption number one, I'm going to ask for your thoughts on this, is do you find that many of the people that find your workshops feel like they've been grieving for a significant amount of time? Or do you also find that people come to your workshops because they they just lost someone special?
Yeah, it's actually a mix of people who've experienced loss at different times, because there are people that come in who've had a loss, years ago, that they're still processing. But there's others who, just yesterday I was contacted by a woman who, or recently I was contacted by a woman who lost her dad 5 weeks ago. And I've also had people who've lost, say, for example, a parent within the last year. And so, and for me, that's pretty early, in the process. And so, but I think it depends on the person. I used to think that the workshops were for people who haven't recently experienced loss, but maybe are sort of further along in terms of time. But I realize now that it's not about the time. It's actually about where the person is at in relation to their grief. So, and people process grief, or, view their grief differently, on a personal level. And they have different paces. People move at different paces in their grief. So I think it's really an individual thing, and it's about, I've had people contact me and say, well, I'm not sure if this is for me. I'm really in the depths of my grief, and I have been struggling for a while. And for that person, I said, well, it sounds like you might need more individual support. I don't think the group setting might be the best kind of platform for you. I think maybe it sounds like you need more intense support, which I can't give in that group setting. So yeah, it depends on where people are at in relation to their grief. So there is always a mix of people um, who've lost loved ones at different times. So it could be years, it could be 10 years, it could be 2 years. It really varies. And so, yeah, I've kind of changed my outlook on, who I can support, because I thought, well, I can't provide intense support, which is probably more needed by people who've recently lost someone. But I realize now that it's actually more about the individual and where they're at, or what their relationship is with their grief and how they're processing it. And so for some people, within the first year, they've maybe gotten to a point where they do just want to have conversations about open conversations about grief, or they want to try a workshop, and they're okay in the group setting. And it obviously, with grief, it's not linear, so you can be at that stage, but then later on you might need more intensive support. So yeah, I think it's just in terms of timing, where the person is at.
Yeah, I know you're right, and because everybody's experience is so unique, and really where they're at, there's certain motivations or certain inspirations that get them to say yes to a workshop such as yours that would probably be so different from the person that they sit next to in the workshop or
Mm.
something like that.
Mm.
It's just it's a curiosity, a personal curiosity. You also mentioned in some of your descriptions, like people will contact you and they'll say that I'm in the depths of my grief and I perhaps am struggling a bit. I often, in my personal experience, a lot of people who contact me, I feel like two words stick out. One, I'm stuck,
Mm.
or two, I suck. I suck at grieving, and
Yeah.
and so they're in a place of like really seeking help, and so I'm
Mm.
really curious, like is thematically, it's a similar question to before, so I apologize for that, but thematically, is there some things that you hear from people that say, oh, I need to try this because of blank?
Mm. Yeah, I remember years ago there was a young woman who came to an event who had lost her grandpa, and she hadn't really talked to anybody about it, and she felt like she was stuck, as you were saying. She felt like she was stuck, and she just wasn't able to express what she was feeling. about that loss and about her loss. And so after the event and during the event, she cried. And so the event was actually more of an open mic platform where people could just come and share their stories and share their creative work around the theme of grief and loss. So people come in with all different kinds of losses, and they just sort of share their experience basically. And during that event, I remember she had a really good cry. And for me, it's always a good sign when people, generally it's a good sign when people are crying, because it's a bit of, I feel like it's an emotional release and they needed that, you know. And it's not necessarily what I've done, or it's not necessarily what someone else has done that's made them cry, but there's something obviously that they connected with, that that prompted that crying. So she did have a cry. I try and always have tissues around just in case. But yeah, and after the event, yeah, she said to me, look, you know, I've been stuck and I haven't been able to I haven't been able to express what I'm feeling. And that she felt she felt relieved after the event, and that she felt that, you know, sort of a weight had been lifted, and she was able to express her grief. And so she wrote me, I guess, a nice note afterwards. And I guess that's something that, you know, people can walk away with. And I hope that they feel relieved, you know, after attending a workshop, or they feel that something has shifted within them in terms of their grief and processing it. So I guess to your question, yeah, so people have come with, you know, just feeling stuck in their grief, and they've felt a bit of a relief afterwards, and that, you know, they're not as heavy, I guess. You know, if you think about it that way, like they feel a bit lighter after leaving or after having attended.
You know, it sure sounds like there's a lot of energy within the group format. Originally, before we started this conversation, I was thinking, oh, it's likely all about the creative expression process, whether it's like putting colors to, some kind of paper, or it's moving your body in certain ways. But I'm like, well, wait a minute, there's a lot here in the witnessing of it. And that kind of makes sense, because there's so many support groups where people sit and talk their grief. But at the same time, how would you put words into the group energy of the workshops that you facilitated?
Can you clarify that question in terms of how would I put words? Yeah. Can you clarify what that means?
I could go into saying, I tell you, I think that, the group energy is dynamic, it's enlivening, like people feel seen, people feel held, people
Mm.
feel cared about. How
Yeah.
would you describe what happens amongst the social setting within the group when you facilitate your workshops?
Hmm. So what I've been told, I guess, by people that have attended, is that they felt that it was a safe space for them to express their grief and to share their experiences. And I know, you know, my intention is always to make people feel um, seen and heard, and make their and to acknowledge and validate their grief and their experiences. That's always sort of a main purpose of mine, is to make sure that everybody's experiences, no matter how different, everybody's experience is validated in that setting. And that, you know, I always talk about, I always open up events and workshops with kind of some guidelines, I guess, for people. And also that they can co-create with me in terms of what's the agreement here, like what are the expectations for this session. And so part of that is not judging others for, you know, having had an experience that's different to yours, or having a different perspective. And that, you know, we do want to sort of validate and acknowledge that grief is a very unique experience. So that's all part of it. And so people, I guess, have that in the back of their mind, you know, because I remember when I did the Mother's Day workshop, which was the animation and writing workshop, even though everybody had a loss connected to motherhood and to motherhood, yeah, everybody had a very different experience. For some people it was about losing their own mother. For some people it was about losing a child. For other people it was about like losing a mother figure or their adoptive mother. Yeah, it was just so varied. And the way people, obviously, the way sort of they might have lost their mother or their child would have been different. And they it's just it was everybody had a very kind of unique experience. There were some overlaps, but I kind of came away, I was amazed that people were so accepting and so just respectful of each other and each other's experiences, because we talk about one not being able to have a mum, and oh sorry, one losing her mum and one losing a child, and then but then others who are talking about their children in the same setting. And I know that I'm always aware that people's different experiences might trigger something in someone else. If you're talking about, one lady said, after losing my mum, I knew I had to have a child. That was her way of sort of, in a way, compensating. She had to be a mum because she had lost her mum, whereas someone else just tried to have a child but couldn't. And so there's I thought, that might be a bit of a tension, that someone's talking about, being able to have a child and that being sort of a way to compensate for not having her own mum, and then someone else who wanted to have a child but couldn't. But I found that people were just very, very respectful and very supportive of each other. And I don't know, I guess part of that, I've been told, is the way that I set up the space, because for me, I know that that's important. And I always start with some basic kind of, it could be kind of emotional housekeeping in a way, because people need to know that, yes, we are all here because we've experienced loss, but our losses are different, and our experiences are going to be different, and that's okay. Whatever your experience is your experience, and that's valid. So yeah, I'm always amazed at how open people are and how respectful they are of each other. And I'm always grateful that, people are able to listen and hear each other out, and not be, I guess, not judge. And that's been really a powerful, I think that's really powerful in the sessions. And even though we're talking about how to creatively process your grief, you can't really do that without acknowledging the other side, which is that we are talking about grief and loss, and they're very sensitive subjects. And you need to feel emotionally safe to even go there, to explore that and to talk about it with others who you mightn't have never met before.
Well, I tell you what, that's great. It makes me think of creating a safe container. You've referred to it as creating a safe space, and so I'm using those terms interchangeably. And I think, in my experience with facilitating grief groups or being amongst settings where there's a group of people and the matters of the heart include the grieving process, I think there's just something like what's sounding universal, because it sounds like it happens in your workshops too, is that there's like this beautiful experience of people just tapping into humanity. And it's
Mm.
like, oh, okay, we don't have to be right, we don't have to be wrong here. We just be ourselves, our authentic selves in this experience. And does that resonate? Is that kind of what you see happen at your workshops?
Yeah, and I see people, it's interesting, I see people sort of open up more as the session goes on, and that they can feel more comfortable, and they become, yeah, it's like they're given themselves permission to be themselves and to sort of be who they are, and know that they're okay, they're safe.
Well said. And then how about the form of creative expression in itself? Another thing is like I hear a lot of self-criticism and self-judgment when it's related to being creative. A lot of
Mm.
Americans will say, "Oh, well, I can't draw, I can't sing, I can't, you name it." How do you, well, first, let me backtrack because I realize I'm assuming here, but I'm curious, like, in your community, do you find that to be common also, where there's a lot of self-criticism or self-judgment about people and their creativity?
Mm. Yeah, I find that in all sorts of workshops when it comes to creativity, because I also I facilitate workshops with people who are recovering from drug and alcohol addiction, and yeah, I think it's just that's universal, like that self-judgment, and that self-criticism. I think it's very normal. I don't necessarily, it doesn't become a major thing in workshops when I'm facilitating workshops around grief and loss. I think because people are maybe more focused on knowing that this is about processing. It's they're not being judged on their creative abilities. But I guess one thing, there's always an option, like when it comes to the opportunity to share with each other, what people have come up with. I never, I never force anybody to share what they've created. If they don't want to share or they don't feel comfortable sharing, then that's totally fine. So, and maybe, sometimes after it does take a bit of courage for the first person to volunteer, to say, I'm happy to share what I've done or what I've written. And then after that, sometimes, after a few people share, then other people say, okay, I think I can share too, so there's a bit of a snowball effect. But yeah, and I guess that's something I can always say in the beginning, which is we all come in having our different experiences with creativity as well, and with writing or with animation. People who came to the animation workshop had never ever tried animation, so it was something totally different. But I think the focus was more on just giving it a try and working together. And so I think that fear of, oh, I don't know if I can do this, was kind of diminished because it was about working together, and the focus was not on the individual, even though in the writing part that they did do individual writing. But yeah, I always give people an option. They if they're not comfortable sharing, they don't have to. And so it's up to, and for me, it's more about knowing that they've given it a try, and whether or not they share, they've still done some work, and they'll get something out of it.
Yeah, thanks for
Mm.
sharing that. I was doing a little bit of homework on you before our interview, and I did read on your website that you did some research, and it sounds like you did a thesis and found out some findings, I guess, for lack of a better term, between a correlation of the grieving process and the creative process. Can you share a little bit more about what you learned through your education and your research?
Yeah, so I wrote a thesis in 2017 about the impact of poetry, performance, and community engagement on the experience of grief and loss. And so I found different things in relation to each kind of element. So with poetry and performance, there was research around how, well, firstly, as a process, you can use writing and poetry to gain insight into your experience and to make meaning out of it. And there's a lot of research around, it's called narrative therapy, and that basically, states that we can reauthor our experiences and we can redefine our experiences and our role within in relation to those experiences. So it's a very kind of powerful way to sort of take agency in our lives and in terms of how we view our experiences through writing or through narrating. Through narrating our experiences, we can start to see things differently or see ourselves differently in relation to those experiences. Like if we, for example, if we see ourselves as, this is sort of just a random example, but if we see ourselves as a victim in a particular situation, then we can use words to empower ourselves to change that and to see ourselves differently. To, for example, like I guess the idea of saying, I'm a survivor rather than a victim, that kind of shift, using language is very powerful and can be very empowering for people. And yeah, in my research, I found that, people can gain insight. You can gain insight into yourself and into your own kind of thought process through poetry and performance as well. When you share your work, you can. One interesting thing that I discovered, which is that by sharing your work or by performing what you create, you can give people insight into an alternative way of living with the presence of absence. So you become, you kind of create a different way of viewing things, a different way of showing how you can live with loss, I guess. And that was something I actually really loved learning about, because I initially came to doing this work through basically performing my own poems and songs, and there's something strange happened where every time I performed and shared some poetry or music, I would have people come up to me afterwards and just basically start sharing their stories and tell me that they could really relate, and they know what they've gone through the same thing, or they've had a similar loss, or they would tell me about their grandma or whatever it was, whoever they lost, and they would start to open up, automatically, without, even though I'd never met them before. And so there was an instant connection there, and I was sort of fascinated by that. And I was thinking, like, what is it that makes them, what makes people just suddenly, like, open up and want to share their experiences? And I realized that, by sharing my experiences, and giving myself permission to do that, I give others permission automatically to share their experiences, and they know that I'm open to sort of talking about grief and loss, and I'm open to hearing it because I myself sort of role modeled that. And so it's just an exchange that happens, and yeah, so yeah, I realized that there's a lot of, there is research, and through actually sharing your insights and your observations about your own experience, people can start to have their own insights and their own way of a different way of viewing their experience, because they hear or they see that oh, okay, there's a different way of looking at this. So you're kind of, through performance, like offering, you kind of offer insights to people and observations of your own experience, and that becomes an example for others, or an alternative way that they can view theirs. So I hope that all makes sense.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. It sounds like some very interesting research, and I can tell that you have a heart of gold. And I think that the people that find you, your gift in their life, especially with creating that safe space to help them creatively express their grief. I guess before we say goodbye, I'm so curious if there's like a theme or a personal mission that you want to share with the listeners of this podcast.
Well, I think my mission is really to let people know that, while the grieving process feels like a very lonesome experience, and it might feel, and it is in a way, because no one can know what you're going through, but I want them to know that they don't have to be lonely in that process, and that there are and in that journey that there are others who they can find people who will give them space to share their grief, or to kind of have their grief validated and acknowledged. And I hope that they find a community, or that they find people who can at least be an ear for them, or listen, and give them space to have that open conversation. Because for a long time, I thought I was the only one who went through what I was going through, because I couldn't find those spaces for me to go and just say, hey, this is really tough, and I lost my mom, and I don't know what to do, and I don't know if this is normal. It's I had no idea, who I could talk to, and I didn't feel comfortable talking with, family members who were also grieving the same loss. And so I just wanted to find other people who might have had a similar experience. And so I kind of didn't, and that's why I created the Grief Cocoon. So yeah, I hope that people find a place where their grief can be acknowledged, because I think that's so important, to have their grief witnessed. So yeah, I just want people to know that they're not alone, even though they might feel like it.
Okay. Gabriela, thank you so much for being a part of Grief Refuge.
Thanks for this has been great. Thanks, Reed.
A special thanks to Gabriela, and a special thanks to you for listening. One thing about Gabriela's work at the Grief Cocoon is that she's available to facilitate workshops anywhere in the world. With her creativity, and with yours, this type of grief processing can be experienced online. So if you're inspired to process grief in creative ways, and also ways that are different from your norm, reach out to Gabriela at the Grief Cocoon, which is thegriefcocoon.com. And I just want to share some deep gratitude for you and your trust in Grief Refuge and our mission. We're here to provide daily companionship throughout your grief journey. This is work I'm meant to do, and I hope our paths cross in the near future. And remember to download the Grief Refuge app for your phone's app store. Grief Refuge provides daily support through compassion and inspiration, all to help you through your grief journey. Thank you, take care, keep honoring your grief, be kind to yourself, and talk to you soon.